You see a man at an auction, but he's not there for cattle or land or a dusty old wagon. He's there for two children, two little kids nobody wants, standing on a wooden block, about to be sold to the highest bidder. And in a town where everything has a price, this mountain man is about to buy something that should never have a price tag. He says two words that stop the whole town cold. I'll buy. But he's not just buying two kids. He's buying a fight. He's buying a secret. And he's about to buy a war with a man who owns the whole territory. Because those kids, they're not who everyone thinks they are. And the man who just bought them has no idea he just signed his own death warrant. The sun over Dry Creek was mean. It beat down on the dust and the sweat and the quiet desperation of a town that was one bad winter away from becoming a ghost. Gideon Hart felt it on the back of his neck as he guided his horse, Thunder, through a crowd that had no business being there. After 6 months alone in the high country, with only the wind for company, the press of all these bodies made his skin crawl. The air was thick with whispers, the kind that cling to bad news. He swung a leg over his saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. The packs on his horse were heavy with a winter's worth of beaver pelts, a small fortune that suddenly felt worthless. Because his eyes landed on the platform in front of the sheriff's office. And on that platform stood two little kids, a boy and a girl, twins by the look of them, maybe 5 years old. They were clutching each other's hands so tight their knuckles were white, like they were the only two solid things in a world that was trying to shake them apart. Their clothes were rags, their feet were bare, and their eyes were ancient. They were dark pools of fear, watching the crowd with a silence that was louder than any scream. Standing beside them, looking like a stuffed sausage in a fancy vest, was Horace Briggs, the saloon keeper. A man who'd sell his own mother for a plug nickel. His voice oiled its way across the dusty street. Now, folks, these here twins come with proper papers. Their ma's gone, their pa's unknown. The law says they're wards of the territory. Sheriff Matthews stood off to the side, his badge looking tarnished in the harsh light. He was staring at the ground, his jaw set like he'd just swallowed a mouthful of nails. He wanted no part of this, and that made it a whole lot worse. Starting bid at $20, a hired auctioneer chirped, his gavel raised. A silence fell over the crowd. Not a respectful silence. It was a heavy, shameful quiet. People looked at their feet. They looked at the sky. They looked anywhere but at those two children on the platform. $20. The price of a decent saddle. The price of two human souls. Gideon felt a familiar, cold fury coiling in his gut. The girl's long, dark hair was the same color as his Sarah's, before the fever took her. And the boy standing there trying to look brave, even though he was trembling. He had the same defiant set to his shoulders as Gideon's own son, lost in that same cruel winter 12 years ago. The auctioneer's arm started to fall. The gavel was about to hit the block, and a voice ripped through the silence, raw and loud, like rock grinding against rock. Stop! Every head in the street turned. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Gideon Hart strode forward. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He didn't look at the shocked faces of the townspeople. He walked right up to Sheriff Matthews. I'll buy those twins, he said, his voice a low growl. He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled his heavy coin purse from his belt, the leather worn smooth from years of use, and began counting out heavy silver dollars into the sheriff's palm. The metallic clink of the coins was the only sound in the dead quiet street. 1, 2, 3. Each coin was a promise. Each coin was a prayer. He didn't stop at 20. He kept going. 30, 40, $50. A trapper's entire season, slapped down on the dusty planks of the law. He was buying them, yes, but he was also making a statement. These children were not cheap. They were not worthless. Now hold on just a minute, Briggs sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. These here children need a proper home, a family. What's a wild mountain man know about raising kids? Gideon turned, slow and deliberate. He leveled a gaze on Briggs that had stared down grizzlies and blizzards, a gaze that was older and harder than the mountains themselves. More than a man who'd sell 'em like cattle, he said, and the words hit Briggs like a slap. The sheriff, looking relieved to have a way out, cleared his throat. The bid's been made and met, Mr. Briggs. The law is the law. He quickly scribbled a bill of sale on a piece of paper, his hands shaking slightly. The transaction was done. Gideon Hart, a man who thought he'd lost everything, now owned 2 children. He tucked the paper into his coat and walked toward the platform, his boots thudding with a finality that echoed through the town. He swung himself up onto the stage. Up close, he could see the dirt smudged on their cheeks, the way they were both shivering despite the heat. He knelt, trying to make his big, rough frame seem smaller, less threatening. "My name's Gideon," he said, his voice softer than he'd used in years. Would you like to come with me?" The boy stared at him, his eyes narrowed with a suspicion that was heartbreaking in a child so young. But the girl, she just studied him. She had a gaze that seemed to see right through the buckskin and the beard, right into the hollowed-out parts of his soul. "Both of us?" she whispered, her voice a tiny, fragile thing. Gideon's throat felt tight. He nodded. "Both of you," he promised. "Together. Always." The girl gave a slow, solemn nod. And just like that, the boy's shoulders relaxed a fraction. The invisible wall around them had cracked. Gideon gathered them up, one in each arm. They weighed next to nothing, like little birds. He could feel their sharp little bones through their thin shirts, and a wave of protective rage washed over him, so fierce it almost buckled his knees. As he held them, the little girl turned her face into his neck, her breath tickling his ear. She whispered a question that shattered the fragile peace he'd just found, a question that changed everything. "Are you our pa now?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Pa, a name he hadn't heard in 12 years, a name he thought was buried forever with his son under a blanket of frozen earth. Memories of Sarah, of their dreams for a big family, of the laughter that used to fill their cabin. It all came rushing back, a ghost pain that was as sharp and real as any knife. He swallowed hard against the lump in his throat, his arms tightening around the 2 small bodies he was holding. He couldn't speak. He could only nod. The crowd parted for him as he carried the twins toward his horse. The whispers followed him, a mix of pity, disapproval, and grudging respect. He could feel Briggs's hateful glare burning into his back, but he didn't care. All that mattered were the 2 lives in his arms. Just as he reached Thunder, a woman stepped out from the crowd. It was Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, a kind woman with flour permanently dusted on her apron. "Mr. Hart," she called out, her voice firm, "those children will need clothes and shoes." She glanced at their bare, dirty feet, her expression a mix of sorrow and determination. Gideon managed a grateful nod. "Much obliged, ma'am. I reckon I've got some learning to do." The mood on the street had changed. The shame was gone, replaced by a cautious curiosity. People were watching him, not as a spectacle, but as a man who had just taken on the world for 2 orphans. He gently settled the twins onto Thunder's broad back. They looked so small up there, dwarfed by the big horse. The boy who hadn't said a word finally spoke, his voice so quiet Gideon had to lean in to hear it. "What's your horse's name?" The simple, childish question was like a key turning in a rusted lock inside Gideon's chest. A warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in a decade. "Thunder," he answered, a small smile touching his lips for the first time that day. "Would you like to learn to ride him?" The boy's eyes went wide, and for the first time, a tiny, fragile smile ghosted across his lips. It was a start. As Gideon led the horse away from the center of town, with the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he knew his life had just taken a sharp, unexpected turn. He had no plan, no idea how to be a father to these 2 broken little birds. But as he looked up at their faces, silhouetted against the dying light, he knew one thing for certain. He would die before he let anyone hurt them ever again. He led Thunder to his supply wagon at the edge of town, the wooden wheels groaning under the weight of his pelts. He carefully lifted the children down, their feet barely making a sound in the dust. "My name's Gideon Hart," he said again, formally this time. "Might I know yours?" The girl, always the braver one, spoke first. "I'm Little Bird," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She nudged her brother. "Samuel?" the boy mumbled, staring at the ground. They were like two wild fawns, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. "You must be hungry," Gideon said, rummaging in his wagon. He pulled out a pouch of dried venison. Their eyes tracked his every move. He handed them each a strip, and Little Bird immediately broke hers in half, giving the larger piece to her brother. They ate like they hadn't seen food in days, slow and deliberate, and the sight of it made Gideon's heart ache. The air was getting cooler, and he saw them shiver. He grabbed a thick wool blanket and wrapped it around their small shoulders, the heavy fabric swallowing them whole. They huddled together underneath it, two small shapes in the growing dark, and that's when a new shadow fell over them. "Well, well, what have we here?" The voice was sharp and cold, like chipping ice. A man in a crisp black suit stepped out of the twilight. He was clean-shaven, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his smile didn't come anywhere near his eyes. At the sight of him, Little Bird made a small, terrified sound and tried to hide behind Gideon's leg. "Mr. Kane," she whispered, her voice trembling. Samuel pressed against her, and together they vanished under the blanket. The man, Kane, tipped his hat. "Gideon Hart, I presume. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Gideon placed a heavy hand on Little Bird's shoulder, a silent promise of protection. "No misunderstanding. I bought them. Legal and fair. The sheriff himself signed the paper." Kane let out a soft, condescending laugh. "Ah, yes, the quaint little auction. A touching display of local charity. Unfortunately, it's irrelevant." He adjusted his cuffs, his movements precise and unnerving. "These children are Apache. Their mother was a squatter on railroad territory. As such, they are the property of the Western Pacific Railroad Company. Your bill of sale is worthless." Property, the word hung in the air, ugly and venomous. "They're children," Gideon said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Not property." Kane's smile tightened. "A matter of perspective. You have 1 week to produce proper guardianship papers from a territorial judge. If you fail to do so, we will be forced to remove them to a more appropriate facility." He gave another mock tip of his hat. "Good evening, Mr. Hart." Gideon watched him walk away, his starched collar disappearing into the gloom. The man was a snake, all polished scales and hidden fangs, and he wielded the law like a weapon. Gideon looked down at the two trembling forms under the blanket. This was bigger than a town auction. This was about money and power, and a railroad that saw two innocent lives as nothing more than a problem to be solved. He had thought buying them was the end of the fight. Now he realized with a sinking feeling in his gut, it was only the beginning. He had 1 week. 1 week to fight a ghost. 1 week to fight the railroad. 1 week to figure out how to become a father and a lawyer and a warrior all at once. And as he looked into Little Bird's terrified eyes, he knew he couldn't fail. But what he didn't know was that Mr. Kane hadn't told him the whole truth. There was another reason the railroad wanted the twins. A much darker reason. A reason buried with their parents. A reason worth killing for. The room above the mercantile was small, but it was clean and safe. Mrs. Peterson had sent up a basket with bread, cheese, and 2 little nightshirts. Gideon watched as the twins, swimming in the borrowed clothes, finally settled onto the single cot. He was about to sit in the chair by the stove when a tiny hand shot out and grabbed his thumb. It was Little Bird. "Stay close," she pleaded, her dark eyes wide with a fear that went bone deep. His heart, which he'd thought was long dead, gave a painful lurch. "I'll be right here," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. He settled on the floor beside them, his back against the cot. He wouldn't let them out of his sight. Little Bird didn't let go of his thumb, holding onto it like a lifeline. He sat there in the flickering lamplight, listening to their breathing even out as they finally drifted off to sleep. And in that quiet room, a fierce, forgotten feeling bloomed in his chest. It was the feeling of being a father. He would do anything for them, absolutely anything. The next morning, acting on a whispered tip from Mrs. Peterson, Gideon found himself standing in front of a neat white house behind a garden of wilting sunflowers. Before he could knock, the door opened. A woman with intelligent eyes and threads of silver in her dark hair stood there. "I'm Eliza Banning," she said, her voice warm but direct. You must be Mr. Hart. She was the town's school teacher, a widow, and Gideon hoped an ally. He explained everything, the auction, the twins, the cold threat from Mr. Kane. As he spoke, Eliza's expression hardened. She knew Kane, and she didn't like him. What you did was brave, Mr. Hart, and it was right, she said. But Kane is a dangerous man, and he rarely loses. She poured them both coffee, her movements thoughtful. The railroad's claim is based on treating them as property, as squatters. But what if they aren't? What if their parents were legally married? Gideon frowned. How could we prove something like that? Eliza's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. The church records? Reverend Matthews kept meticulous records for 20 years. If their parents' union was blessed by any church in this territory, there will be proof. A legal marriage would make those children legitimate citizens. It would give them rights Kane couldn't just sweep aside. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. They returned to the mercantile, where Eliza, with a gentle kindness that amazed Gideon, got the twins cleaned up and dressed in proper clothes she'd brought from her own home. Samuel wore sturdy trousers and Little Bird a faded but clean dress. For the first time, they looked like children, not refugees. As they ate fresh bread and apples Eliza had packed, their cautious eyes started to show a flicker of trust. Hope was a fragile, dangerous thing, but Gideon felt a glimmer of it. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The church records were kept in a small, dusty back room that smelled of old paper and forgotten prayers. For hours, Gideon and Eliza hunched over massive, leather-bound ledgers, their fingers tracing columns of faded ink. The silence was thick, broken only by the rustle of brittle pages. Gideon was about to give up, the hope from that morning starting to curdle into despair, when Eliza gasped. "Here!" she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "Look!" Gideon leaned over her shoulder. There, in the careful, looping script of Reverend Matthews, was an entry from 5 years ago. Thomas Gilroy, he read, married to Morning Star, of the Apache people, witnessed and blessed by Reverend Matthews himself. Gilroy, a railroad worker, Gideon guessed. That would explain why the twins were found near the tracks. And their mother, Morning Star. It was all there, in black and white. "This changes everything," Eliza breathed, a triumphant smile on her face. "They're citizens. Kane can't touch them now." A wave of relief washed over Gideon, so powerful it almost made him dizzy. They had done it. They had found the proof they needed. But as they stepped out of the church, blinking in the bright afternoon sun, that relief vaporized. Across the street, standing in the shadow of the saloon, were 3 men. Horace Briggs, the saloon keeper, Mr. Kane, the railroad man, and a cavalry sergeant, his uniform crisp, his face hard as granite. They were talking, their heads close together, and all 3 of them were staring directly at the church. Kane had been 1 step ahead of them the entire time. He hadn't been waiting for Gideon to fail. He had been preparing for him to succeed. The marriage certificate wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning of a whole new war. And Kane had just brought in the U.S. Army. Eliza saw it too. "That's Sergeant Barnes," she whispered, her face pale. "He handles Indian affairs for the territory." Gideon's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about the railroad anymore. This was about jurisdiction, treaties, and laws that were written to be broken. Kane wasn't just going to take the twins. He was going to use the full force of the United States government to do it. They hurried back inside the church, their earlier triumph replaced by a gnawing dread. They quickly made a copy of the marriage entry, the precious piece of paper feeling flimsy and powerless now. That evening, at Eliza's insistence, they all had supper at her small, welcoming house. The smell of beef stew and cornbread filled the air, a stark contrast to the fear knotting Gideon's stomach. As the twins happily sopped up gravy, Eliza made an offer that stunned him. "Gideon," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you can't do this alone. I have a spare room upstairs. Let them stay here. Let me help you care for them. Properly." The kindness of her offer, the simple decency of it, almost broke him. He was a mountain man, a loner. He didn't know how to accept help. But looking at Little Bird and Samuel, who were starting to look at this small house as a sanctuary, He knew he couldn't refuse. "That's mighty kind of you, Eliza," he managed to say. Later that night, as he awkwardly tried to tuck the children into their new cots, Little Bird giggled. "You're doing it wrong, Pa," she said, then clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide as if she'd said a forbidden word. The name hit him right in the heart, a sweet, painful arrow. "Show me then," he said gruffly, trying to hide the emotion choking him. Samuel, speaking up more than he had since Gideon found him, demonstrated from his own cot, pulling the blanket up to his chin with comical seriousness. The sound of their laughter, soft and clear in the quiet house, was the most beautiful thing Gideon had ever heard. It was the sound of a family, and he would burn the world down to protect it. But just as a fragile sense of peace settled over the house, it was shattered by a loud, heavy knock on the front door. The twins froze, their laughter dying in their throats. Gideon's hand went instantly to the rifle he'd been cleaning. Eliza peered through the window. It was the deputy looking miserable. She opened the door. "Evening, Miss Banning," he mumbled, holding out an official-looking paper. "This is for Mr. Hart." Gideon took the paper. It was a telegraph, a summons from Fort Verde. It stated in cold, legal language that the children known as Samuel and Little Bird were to be turned over to Army custody in 3 days' time. Kane hadn't just brought a sergeant to town. He had gone over everyone's heads. He had used the telegraph wire to reach out and wrap the cold hand of military law around their little sanctuary. 3 days. The clock was ticking. And this time, they weren't just fighting a railroad man. They were fighting the United States Army. And the summons contained one final, chilling line. It named Thomas Gilroy their father, not as a citizen, but as a deserter and a thief, and his children as accessories to his crimes. The lie was so audacious, so cruel, it took Gideon's breath away. Thomas Gilroy wasn't just a railroad worker, he was a wanted man, at least according to this piece of paper. Kane wasn't just trying to claim the children as property, he was painting them as the children of a criminal, making it even easier to strip them of their rights. "This is a lie," Eliza said, her voice shaking with rage as she read the summons over Gideon's shoulder. "I knew Thomas and Morning Star. He was a good man, an honest man." She knew them. The words hung in the air. Gideon looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Her offer of help, her knowledge of the town. It wasn't just a school teacher's kindness. It was personal. "You knew their parents?" he asked, his voice low. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "Morning Star was my friend," she whispered. "She taught me so much about this land. Thomas was building a home for them, a real home. When they died in a flash flood last spring, I tried to find the children, but Briggs got to them first. He said they were his property, found on his claim." Another piece of the puzzle slammed into place. This wasn't random. Briggs hadn't just stumbled upon them. He had taken them, knowing exactly who they were. And Kane wanted them for a reason that had nothing to do with railroad policy. There was something else going on, a deeper, dirtier secret, and it was buried with Thomas and Morning Star. The next morning, Gideon strode into the telegraph office. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and the rhythmic clicking of the key. He dictated a message to the territorial judge in Prescott, the same judge who would have to approve the guardianship papers. He laid out the facts, the legal marriage, the false accusations against their father, the railroad's overreach. He requested an urgent clarification of their rights. The reply, the operator said, could take days. Days they didn't have. As he left, he felt a shift in the town. People who had avoided his gaze now nodded at him. The baker pressed a bag of warm rolls into his hand. "For the little ones," he said. The blacksmith offered to shoe thunder for free. The town was waking up. They could smell the rot coming off Kane and the railroad. But Kane was already making his next move. Outside the schoolhouse, a small crowd had gathered. Kane was nailing a new notice to the community post. It was a notice of eminent domain. The Western Pacific Railroad was officially seizing all lands previously belonging to the deserter Thomas Gilroy, including his half-finished homestead. It was a brazen land grab, disguised as legal procedure. And Gideon knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the answer to this whole mystery was on that land, Whatever Cain was truly after, it was there. He's not just after the children, Eliza said, standing beside Gideon, her face grim. He's after what their father left behind. The pieces were connecting, forming a dark and ugly picture. Thomas Gilroy must have found something, or known something, that was a threat to Cain and the railroad. And now Cain was using the children as pawns to get his hands on it. They had 2 days left. 2 days until Sergeant Barnes and his soldiers arrived to take the twins. They had to get to that homestead before Cain did. "We need the town," Eliza said, her voice filled with a new, fierce determination. "We need to call a town meeting. We have to show them the marriage certificate, tell them the truth about Thomas. If we can get the whole town to stand with us, even the army might hesitate." It was a desperate, risky plan. It could backfire, turning everyone against them for good. But as Gideon looked at Little Bird and Samuel, who were drawing on a slate inside the schoolhouse, their faces filled with a fragile, newfound happiness, he knew they had no other choice. They had to fight. They would show the town the truth. They would make their stand. But they had no idea that Cain had one more card to play, an ace up his sleeve, a witness who was about to crawl out of the woodwork and tell a lie so poisonous it would destroy everything they were fighting for, a witness no one would ever suspect. The town meeting was held in the church, the only building in Dry Creek big enough to hold the simmering tension. The pews were packed. Every face in town was there, their expressions a mix of curiosity, fear, and suspicion. Gideon stood at the front with Eliza, the marriage certificate in his hand. He wasn't a man of many words, and his heart hammered against his ribs. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, the blacksmith, the baker, Mrs. Peterson, men he'd traded with for years. He told them the story, simply, directly. He told them about the auction, about the love he already felt for these two lost children, about the lies Cain was spinning. Then Eliza spoke. Her voice, clear and steady, filled the church. She told them about her friendship with Morning Star, about Thomas Gilroy's dream of building a life for his family. She held up the copy of the marriage certificate. "This is the truth," she declared. "These are the children of a legal Christian marriage. They are citizens. They belong here, with us." A murmur went through the crowd. You could feel the tide turning. People were nodding. Mrs. Peterson stood up. "Those children deserve a home, not some cold government facility." The blacksmith rose to his feet next. "The railroads pushed us around for too long. This ain't right." One by one, people started to stand, a chorus of support rising in the dusty church. It was working. Hope, bright and powerful, surged through Gideon. And then the church door swung open. Mr. Cain strode in, his polished boots echoing on the wooden floor. He wasn't alone. Beside him was Sheriff Matthews, and behind them, looking nervous and shifty, was Horace Briggs, the saloon keeper. "A very touching story," Cain said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A lovely piece of fiction. But I'm afraid I have a witness who can tell us what really happened." He gestured to Briggs. Briggs shuffled forward, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. I was there," he stammered, his gaze fixed on the floor. "The day Thomas Gilroy died. It wasn't no flash flood." He took a shaky breath. "He was running. He'd stolen a payroll box from the railroad. He told me himself. He hid it somewhere on his land. The flood, it was just bad luck. But he was a thief. And those kids, their mother, she was in on it." The lie was masterful. It twisted the truth just enough to be believable. It explained Cain's obsession with the land, a hidden payroll. It was a motive everyone in this poor, dusty town could understand. The murmuring in the crowd changed. The support curdled back into suspicion. A man who would steal a payroll was not a man to be defended. Cain smiled, a cold, triumphant smirk. He had played his ace. He had poisoned the well. And as the townspeople began to whisper and look away, Gideon knew they had lost. The meeting was a disaster. They were more alone now than ever before. They walked back to Eliza's house in a fog of defeat. The stares of the townspeople followed them, no longer friendly, but filled with doubt. The 3-day deadline was now less than 24 hours away. Sergeant Barnes and his men would arrive with the morning sun. "He's lying," Eliza insisted, pacing her small living room. "Briggs is lying. There was no stolen payroll." But they believe him, Gideon said, his voice flat. He felt a despair so heavy it was like a physical weight on his shoulders. He had failed them. He looked at the twins who were sitting quietly at the table, sensing the new wave of fear that had washed over the house. Little Bird walked over and tugged on his sleeve. In her other hand, she was holding a small, smooth river stone, painted with a simple design, a bird in flight over a winding creek. "Mama gave me this," she whispered. "She said to keep it safe. She said it shows the way home." Gideon took the stone. It was a simple, childish drawing. But then Eliza gasped. She grabbed a tattered map from a drawer, a hand-drawn map of the territory. It was a map Morning Star had made for her years ago. She spread it on the table. "Gideon, look," she said, her voice trembling. The winding creek on the stone. It matched a small, unnamed tributary on the map, a creek that ran right through Thomas Gilroy's property. And the bird in flight, it was drawn directly above a cluster of oddly shaped rocks. It wasn't just a child's drawing, it was a map. Morning Star had left her children a message, a clue to the location of their home, or perhaps something more. "The payroll," Gideon breathed. "If Briggs is lying, maybe he's lying about what Thomas hid. Maybe it wasn't a payroll at all." There was only one way to find out. They had to go. Tonight, under the cover of darkness. They had to get to the homestead, find those rocks, and uncover the truth before Kane and the army descended on them in the morning. It was a reckless, desperate plan. The property was miles out of town, the terrain was rough, and Kane would have men watching. But it was their only hope. Gideon looked at Eliza, and she nodded, her eyes filled with a steely resolve. He looked at the twins who were watching him with a trust that both terrified and strengthened him. He was their paw, and he would not let them down. He saddled Thunder, his movements swift and silent in the moonless night. Eliza bundled up the sleeping twins in heavy blankets. Together, the four of them, the mountain man, the school teacher, and the two orphans, slipped out of the sleeping town. They were a makeshift family on a desperate mission, riding toward a secret that could either save them or get them all killed. The race was on. The ride was tense and silent. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sounded like a threat. Gideon kept Thunder to the shadows, his senses on high alert. Eliza rode behind him, holding the sleeping twins, her small frame radiating a courage that humbled him. They followed the creek bed, the sound of the water a constant murmur beside them. After what felt like an eternity, they saw it. Silhouetted against the star-dusted sky was the skeletal frame of a half-built cabin, Thomas Gilroy's homestead. They had made it. They dismounted, and Gideon gently took Samuel from Eliza's arms. They crept toward the cabin, moving like ghosts through the tall grass. And then Gideon saw them, a cluster of large granite boulders, shaped just like the ones on the map. They stood like silent sentinels near the edge of the property. This was the place. Working by the faint light of a heavily shielded lantern, they began to search. They ran their hands over the cold stone, looking for any sign of a loose rock, a hidden cavity. Nothing. Desperation began to creep in. Had they been wrong? Was it all just a child's trinket? Just then, Little Bird stirred in Eliza's arms. She blinked sleepily, her eyes adjusting to the dark. She looked at the rocks, and then at the stone in Gideon's hand. "Upside down," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. Gideon frowned. "What?" "The bird," she said, pointing a tiny finger. "It flies to the sun, not the moon." Gideon looked at the stone again. He had been holding it with the bird flying downward. He flipped it over, and his blood ran cold. The winding creek was the same, but the bird in flight, when viewed from this new angle, was no longer just a bird. Its wings and tail formed a perfect, unmistakable arrow. An arrow pointing not at the cluster of rocks, but to a spot on the ground just beside the largest one. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a loose piece of timber and started digging where the arrow pointed. The ground was soft, recently disturbed. A few inches down, the wood hit something hard. Not rock, metal. He cleared away the dirt with his bare hands, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was a box, a heavy iron lock box. But it wasn't a payroll box. It was smaller, a personal strong box. The lock was rusted shut. With a grunt, Gideon used the timber as a lever. The metal shrieked in protest, and with a final jarring crack, the lock broke. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside there was no gold, no stacks of stolen money. There was just a thick, leather-bound ledger and a single, sealed envelope. Gideon opened the ledger. The pages were filled with Thomas Gilroy's neat, precise handwriting. It wasn't a confession, it was an account book. And it was damning. Page after page detailed a massive criminal conspiracy. Thomas, as a surveyor for the railroad, had discovered that Kane and his superiors were using fraudulent claims and forged documents to systematically cheat settlers and Apache tribes out of their land. They were stealing the territory right out from under the government's nose, and Thomas had the proof. The names, the dates, the illegal transactions. It was all there. He wasn't a thief. He was a whistleblower. He had been on his way to Prescott to deliver this ledger to the territorial judge when he died. Kane hadn't been hunting for a stolen payroll. He had been hunting for this, the evidence that could send him to the gallows. A rustle in the bushes made Gideon freeze. He blew out the lantern, plunging them into darkness. His hand flew to his pistol. They weren't alone. Two figures emerged from the shadows. It wasn't Kane. It was Sheriff Matthews and Deputy Miller. "We saw your light," the sheriff said, his voice low. "Figured it had to be you." Gideon stayed silent, his gun still raised. "Briggs came to see me," Matthews continued, taking a step closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "He confessed. Kane paid him to lie about the payroll, threatened to burn down his saloon if he didn't. He couldn't live with it. He told me everything." The sheriff looked ashamed. "I've been letting Kane run this town for too long because I was scared, but seeing you stand up for those kids, it reminded me what this badge is supposed to stand for." Just then, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the night. A lot of them. Fast. "It's Barnes," the deputy said, his voice tight with panic. "Kane must have gotten spooked and sent for the cavalry early." They were trapped. The soldiers were closing in. They had the truth in their hands, but they were about to be arrested, or worse, before they could use it. There was nowhere to run. Eliza clutched the twins, her face a mask of terror. This was it, the end of the line. But Gideon Hart wasn't a man who backed down. He looked at the ledger in his hands, at the family he had sworn to protect, and at the lawman who had finally found his courage. "Sheriff," he said, his voice calm and steady in the darkness, "I'm going to need you to deputize me." They didn't have to wait long. Sergeant Barnes and a dozen troopers thundered onto the property, rifles at the ready, followed closely by a triumphant-looking Mr. Kane. They surrounded the small group by the rocks. "It's over, Hart," Kane sneered, dismounting. "Drop your weapons. Sergeant, arrest this man for trespassing, theft, and kidnapping." Sergeant Barnes, a hard-faced veteran, looked from Kane to Gideon, his eyes taking in the scene. "Mr. Hart," he said, his voice all business, "I have orders to take the children into custody." "You'll do no such thing, Sergeant," Sheriff Matthews said, stepping forward, his badge gleaming in the moonlight. "These children are citizens of this territory, under my protection, and Mr. Hart here is my duly appointed deputy." Kane laughed. "Don't be ridiculous, Sheriff. Your local authority means nothing here." "It does when a federal crime has been committed," Gideon said. He held up the ledger. "This book contains detailed proof that Mr. Kane and his associates at the Western Pacific Railroad have been engaged in a massive conspiracy of fraud and land theft against the United States government and its citizens." He tossed the ledger to Sergeant Barnes. The sergeant caught it, his expression unreadable. He opened it, scanning a page. Kane's face went white. "That's a forgery! A desperate lie from a common thief!" Barnes ignored him. He kept reading, his brow furrowed in concentration. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The fate of everyone there hung on the decision of this one soldier. Finally, Barnes closed the book. He looked at Kane, his eyes as cold and hard as steel. "Mr. Kane," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government." Kane stared, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. "You can't be serious. My company built this territory." "And it looks like you tried to steal it too," Barnes said flatly. He nodded to two of his troopers. Take him. As the soldiers clamped irons on a sputtering, furious Cain, Gideon finally allowed himself to breathe. It was over. It was really over. He knelt and pulled Little Bird and Samuel into a hug, burying his face in their hair. They were safe. They were his. Eliza knelt beside them, her hand on his shoulder, and for the first time, their small, broken group felt completely whole. There was one last thing, the envelope. Gideon had almost forgotten it. He broke the seal. Inside was a letter, written in Thomas Gilroy's hand. My dearest children, it began. If you are reading this, it means I have failed. But know that I love you more than words can say. This ledger will expose the truth and, I hope, keep you safe. There is one more secret you must know. Your mother, Morning Star, was not just an Apache. She was the daughter of a great chief, and this land, all of it, was her dowry, legally signed over and filed with the territorial office. It is yours. It is your home. Live here, grow strong, never forget who you are. It wasn't just a homestead. It was an inheritance, a legacy. Their roots ran deep in this soil. This was their home, and now it was Gideon's too. The sun was rising as they rode back to Dry Creek, not as fugitives, but as a family. The town that had doubted them now greeted them as heroes. Cain was gone, Briggs was humbled, and the shadow of the railroad had lifted. Gideon, with Eliza's help, filed the guardianship papers and the deed to the land. There were no more questions, no more threats. They were legally and truly a family. He was no longer just Gideon Hart, the lonely mountain man. He was Pa, a name he never thought he'd hear again, a name that was now the most precious thing he owned. He had walked into town looking to trade pelts for supplies. He was leaving with something infinitely more valuable. He had found a reason to live again. He had found his heart. He had found his home. Every story teaches us something. This one teaches us that family isn't just about blood. It's about love and sacrifice and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the whole world is against you. It's about finding light in the darkest of places. If you believe in the power of a family like Gideon's, show your support by hitting that like button. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story that reminds us of the good in the world. What would you have done in Gideon's place? Let me know in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how this community stands for what's right. Until next time, stay safe and remember that the best treasures are the ones money can't buy.